All the Young Dudes by Miss King Bean, 89. Chapter 1. Summer, 1971. St. Edmunds. Saturday, 7th of August, 1971. He woke up in the dark. It was too hot in the little room they'd put him in, being early August, though he supposed that could be the fever. He always had a high temperature the morning after. They used to put him in a room with a window, but a few months ago he'd been able to smash one of them, and if it hadn't had bars anyway, then he'd have escaped. He'd heard them talking about restraining him as he got older. He tried not to think about it. He remembered the feeling of hunger, so intense it transformed into rage. He remembered howling and keening for hours, circling the cell over and over again. Perhaps they'd let him off lessons today and he could sleep. It was the summer holidays anyway, and not fair that he had to do lessons when all the other boys were allowed to spend all day dossing about, playing football or watching telly. Sitting up, he stretched carefully, paying attention to every ache and pop of his joints. There was a fresh claw mark behind his left ear, and a deep bite in his right thigh. He rubbed his hand over his scalp where his hair was shaved very close to his head and bristled against his fingers. He hated it. But every boy at the children's home had the same severe buzz cut. It meant that when they were allowed out in town on weekends, everyone knew they were St. Edmunds boys, which was probably the point. The shopkeepers knew who to look out for. Not that the boys themselves did anything to subvert expectations. They'd been told so often that they were the dregs of society, left behind and unwanted, so why not cause a little havoc? Remus heard footsteps at the end of the hall. It was Matron. He could smell her, hear her heartbeat. His senses were always amplified after one of his episodes. He stood up, pulling a blanket round himself despite the heat, and padded toward the door to listen harder. She was not alone. There was a man with her. He smelled old and somehow different. A thick iron scent which reminded Remus vaguely of his father. It was magic. "Are you sure it's worth the time?" Matron was asking the stranger. "He's really one of our worst cases." "Oh, yes," the man replied. His voice was rich and warm like chocolate. "We're very sure. Is this where you keep him during—" "His episodes," the matron finished in her clipped nasal voice. "For his safety. He started biting since his last birthday." "I see," the man replied, sounding thoughtful rather than concerned. "May I ask, madam, what is it you know about the young man's affliction?" "Everything I need to know," Matron replied, coldly. "He's been here since he was 5, and he's always been trouble. Not just because he's one of your sort." "My sort?" the man replied, calm and unperturbed. Matron lowered her voice almost to a whisper, but Remus could still hear. "My brother was one. Haven't seen him in years, of course, but he occasionally asks me favours. St. Edmunds is a very special institution. We're equipped for problem cases." Remus heard the jangle of keys. "Now you must let me see him first. He often needs patching up. I don't know why you wanted to see him after a full moon in the first place, if you already knew." The old man did not reply, and Matron walked toward Remus's room, her patent leather heels clicking on the stone floor. She knocked on the door 3 times. "Lupin, are you awake?" "Yeah," he replied, pulling his blanket tighter. They took his clothes off him to stop them getting torn. "Yes, Matron," Matron corrected him through the door. "Yes, Matron," Remus muttered, as the key turned in the lock and creaked open. The door was plain wood, and he knew he could easily smash it during an episode, but had been fitted with silver plating after the window incident. Just the smell of it made him feel queasy and headachy. The door opened. Light poured in like water, and he blinked wildly. As Matron entered the room, he automatically took a step back. She was a bird-like, pointy sort of woman, with a long, thin nose and dark, beady eyes. She regarded him warily. "Need any bandages this time?" He showed her his wounds. They weren't bleeding anymore. He'd noticed that the injuries he inflicted upon himself, though deep, healed faster than any other cuts and scrapes. He'd never needed stitches. The scars never faded, however, and left silvery slash marks across his body. Matron knelt before him, dabbing him with antiseptic and wrapping him in itchy gauze. This done, she handed him his clothes and he dressed quickly in front of her. "You have a visitor," she said, finally, as he pulled his t-shirt over his head. It was grey, like all their clothes. "Who?" he asked, looking her in the eye because he knew she didn't like it. "A teacher. He's here to talk to you about school." "Don't want to," he replied. He hated school. "Tell him to get lost." Matron clipped him round the ear. He'd expected it and didn't flinch. "Less of the lip," she snapped. "You'll do as you're told or I'll leave you in here for the rest of the day. Come on now." She grabbed his arms and pulled him forward. He scowled, thought about fighting her off, but there was no point. She really might lock him in again, and he was curious about the stranger now, especially as the scent of magic grew stronger as they moved down the shadowy corridor. The man waiting for them was quite tall and dressed in the strangest suit Remus had ever seen. It was velvet, a deep maroon colour with elaborate gold embroidery at the cuffs and lapels. His tie was midnight blue. He must have been very old indeed. His hair was white as snow, and he had an incredibly long beard which must have reached his navel. Strange as he looked, Remus didn't feel intimidated as he did with most grown-ups. The man had kind eyes, and smiled at Remus from behind half-moon spectacles as they approached. He extended a hand. "Mr. Lupin," the old man said warmly. "A pleasure to meet you." Remus stared, entranced. No one had ever addressed him with such respect before. He felt almost embarrassed. He shook the man's hand, feeling an electric burn as he did so, like battery acid. "Hi," he replied, staring. "I'm Professor Dumbledore. I wonder if you would join me in a turn about the grounds. It's such a lovely day out." Remus glanced up at Matron, who nodded. This in it of itself was worth having to talk about school with an oddly dressed stranger. She never let him outside during a full moon, not even with supervision. They carried on down a few more corridors, just the two of them. Remus was sure he'd never seen Dumbledore at St. Edmund's before, but he certainly seemed to know his way round. Once they were finally outside, Remus breathed deeply, the warm summer sunlight washing over him. The grounds, as Dumbledore had called them, were not extensive. A patch of yellowing grass the boys used for football, and a small patio terrace with weeds growing up through the cracks in the crazy paving. "How are you feeling, Mr. Lupin?" the old man asked. Remus shrugged. He felt the same way he always did afterward, sore and restless. Dumbledore didn't snap at him for insolence, merely continued to smile down at him as they walked slowly round the perimeter fence. "What do you want?" Remus finally asked, kicking a stone out of his way. "I suspect you already have some idea," Dumbledore replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a brown paper bag. Remus could smell sherbet lemon, and sure enough, Dumbledore offered him a sweet. He took it and sucked. "Your magic," he said plainly, "like my dad." "Do you remember your father, Remus?" He shrugged again. He didn't very well. All his memory could ever drag up was the shape of a tall, skinny man wearing a long cloak, looming over him, crying. He had assumed that had been the night he was bitten. He remembered that well enough. "He was magic," Remus said. "He could make stuff happen. Mum was normal." Dumbledore smiled at him kindly. "Is that what Matron has told you?" Some of it I knew. He's dead anyway. Topped himself." Dumbledore looked slightly taken aback by this, which pleased Remus. It was a point of pride having a tragic backstory. He didn't think about his father often, other than to consider whether he would have killed himself if Remus hadn't been bitten. He carried on. "Mum's not dead, though. Just didn't want me. So I'm here." He looked round. Dumbledore had stopped walking. They were at the furthest edge of the grounds now, by the tall back fence. There was a loose board which no one knew about. Remus could slip through it if he wanted to and get on to the main road in town. He never really went anywhere in particular, just wandered around waiting for the police to pick him up and bring him back. It was better than doing nothing. "Do you like it here?" Dumbledore was asking. Remus snorted. "Course I bloody don't." He side-eyed Dumbledore, but didn't get in trouble for swearing.
"No, I didn't think so," the old man observed. "I hear you're something of a troublemaker. Is that right?" "Ain't any worse than the others," Remus said. "We're troubled boys." "Yes, I see."
Dumbledore stroked his beard as if Remus had said something of extreme significance.
"Got another sweet?"
Remus held out a hand expectantly. Dumbledore handed him the bag, and he couldn't believe his luck. The old fool was a complete pushover. He chewed the lozenge this time, feeling it crunch like glass between his teeth, sherbet exploding on his tongue like fireworks.
"I run a school, you know. The same school your father went to."
That threw Remus for a loop. He swallowed the sweet and scratched his head. Dumbledore continued.
"It's a very special sort of school for wizards like me, and like you. Would you like to learn magic, Remus?"
Remus shook his head fervently.
"I'm too thick,"
he said firmly.
"I won't get in." "I'm sure that's not true at all. Ask her."
Remus jerked his head back toward the tall grey building where Matron lay in wait.
"Can't hardly read even. I'm stupid."
Dumbledore looked at him for a long time.
"You haven't had a very easy start in life, Mr. Lupin, and I am very sorry about that. I knew your father, only a little, and I'm sure he wouldn't have wanted... Anyway, I'm here to offer you something different, a place among your own kind, perhaps even a way to channel all of this anger you have."
Remus stared at him. What difference did it make if he was in one home or another? Matron never gave him sweets and didn't smell like magic. The kids at Dumbledore's school couldn't be worse than the St. Edmund's boys, and if they were, then at least he could hold his own in a fight now. But there was always a but.
"What about my episodes?" he asked, folding his arms. "I'm dangerous, you know." "Yes, Remus, I know," Dumbledore replied sadly.
He placed a hand on Remus's shoulder very gently.
"We'll see what we can come up with. Leave it to me."
Remus shook him off and chewed on another sherbet lemon. They walked back to the building in silence, both satisfied that they understood each other now. Chapter 2. First Year. The Hogwarts Express. Remus rubbed his scalp again, then his nose, which kept running. It had been bothering him since dinner the evening before, when another boy had punched him. To be fair, Remus had kicked him first, but the boy, Malcolm White, was 14 and twice the size of the 11-year-old Remus. Malcolm had made some crack about Remus going to a special school for backwoods kids, and he'd had to retaliate. He had a black eye now, which he regretted. Everyone at the new school would think he was a yob, but then he supposed he was a yob. Matron slapped his hand away from his head and he scowled up at her. They stood in the huge ticket hall at King's Cross staring at 2 platform numbers. There was number 9, then number 10. Matron looked at the letter in her hand again.
"For goodness sake," she muttered. "We have to run at the barriers," Remus said. "I told you."
"Don't be ridiculous," Matron said.
"I'm not running at anything." "I'll go then. Leave me here."
Remus had only half believed Dumbledore when he'd explained how to access platform 9 3/4, but then packages had started arriving for him, delivered by owls and containing strange books and weird clothes and all sorts of oddments like quills and parchment. Dumbledore had been unfailingly generous over the last month. He presented Remus with a list of things he would need for his new school and promised to send him as much of it as he could from the second-hand supplies at Hogwarts. Now Remus was willing to believe almost anything the old man said. He'd never owned so many possessions before and was actually glad when Matron had locked everything in her office so it wouldn't get pinched by the other boys. Now it had all been crammed into a battered old charity shop suitcase, which he had to hold in a very particular way so it wouldn't fall apart. "I'm not leaving you anywhere, Lupin. Just wait here while I find a guard." Matron clipped off toward the ticket office, her big backside wobbling as she went. Remus glanced about furtively, then licked his lips. It might be his only chance. He ran at the barrier full pelt, squeezing his eyes shut as he approached the metal turnstiles. But he didn't hit anything. The atmosphere changed and he opened his eyes to find himself standing on a completely different platform, surrounded by people. Not people. Wizards. The train itself was huge, gorgeous and old-fashioned. The Hogwarts Express. He clutched his suitcase with both hands, biting his lip. There were lots of other children his own age and older, but they were all with their families, some of them crying as they were hugged and kissed by their protective mothers. He felt very small and very alone, and thought it best just to hurry and get on the train. Inside, he couldn't reach the luggage rack to stow away his things, so he chose an empty carriage and sat the suitcase on the seat beside him. He watched the people on the platform through the window, pressed his forehead against the cold glass. He wondered if they all came from wizard families too. He wondered if any of them had episodes like he did. He didn't think so. None of them seemed to have scars. A lot of them were wearing normal clothes like he was, albeit with fewer holes and patches, but some were wearing long dark robes and tall pointed hats. Lots of other kids had owls or cats carried in baskets. He even saw one girl with a tiny lizard perched on her shoulder. Remus was starting to feel even more nervous, his stomach roiling as he realized that despite everything Dumbledore had said about being among his own kind, he would be just as out of place at Hogwarts as he was everywhere else. Just then he realized that someone was staring back at him from the platform. It was another boy, his own age. He was tall and slim, but not skinny like Remus. He had dark hair, much longer than any of the other boys he'd seen, curling gracefully to his shoulders. He had fine, high cheekbones, a full mouth, and startlingly blue eyes. Seeing Remus staring, the other boy arched one perfect eyebrow in a gesture that clearly said, "And what are you looking at?" Remus stuck his tongue under his bottom lip so that his chin bulged, pulling an ugly face. The other boy smirked slightly, then threw up 2 fingers at him. Remus almost laughed.
"Sirius, what do you think you're doing? Come here at once!"
A rather severe-looking witch with the same angular eyebrows as the boy stepped into view, yanking her son away from the window. The boy rolled his eyes but obeyed, and they disappeared further up the platform. Remus sat back in the beaten leather seat inside. He was getting hungry. He hoped the journey wasn't going to be too long. Matron had packed him 2 dry cheese and pickle sandwiches and an apple, but he didn't fancy them. After a few more minutes, the door to his compartment burst open and a girl came rushing in. She ignored Remus, flying to the window, pressed her hands against the glass and waved frantically at her family standing on the platform. She was small and pale, with bright red hair pulled back in a tight plait. Her face was blotchy from crying. She kept waving as the train drew away, and her parents waved back, blowing kisses. A sour-faced girl stood beside them, her arms folded. Once the train had completely left the station, the red-haired girl sat down opposite Remus, sighing deeply. She looked at him with huge green eyes, glistening with tears.
"It's so horrible saying goodbye, isn't it?"
She had a high middle-class accent. Yeah, I suppose," Remus nodded, self-conscious. He didn't really like girls. St. Eddie's was single-sex, and the only contact he had with women was the matron and the school nurse. They were both mean old bitches. The girl was looking at him curiously.
"Are you from a Muggle family too? My name's Lily."
Remus, he replied awkwardly. "My dad was a wizard, but I didn't know him. Well, I grew up with Muggles."
"I couldn't believe it when I got my letter."
She smiled warmly, cheering up.
"But I can't wait to see what it's like, can you?"
Remus couldn't think how to answer her, but he didn't have to. The door slid open once more and a boy poked his head in. He had long black hair, like the boy Remus had pulled faces at, but it was poker straight. He had a long nose and wore a deep frown. "There you are, Lily. I've been looking for ages," he said, giving Remus a dirty look. The sort Remus was quite used to.
"Sev!"
Lily jumped out of her seat and threw her arms around the other boy.
"I'm so glad to see you."
He patted her shoulder shyly, his cheeks slightly pink. "Come and sit in my carriage. There's plenty of room."
"Oh." Lily looked back. "Can Remus come? He's all by himself."
"I'm not sure." The other boy, Sev, looked Remus up and down, taking him in piece by piece. The thuggish haircut, the fraying jeans, the worn-out t-shirt, the second-hand suitcase. There might not be that much room. Remus slouched down in his seat, propping his feet up on the bench opposite. "Get lost, then. I don't want to go to your stupid carriage." He looked out of the window purposefully. Lily and the other boy left. Remus let his feet drop back down to the floor. He sighed. It was noisy outside his little compartment. He could hear shrieking and laughter and owls hooting and a few younger students still crying. Once again he found himself locked away from everyone else. He was starting to wonder if this was just his lot in life. Perhaps once he got to this Hogwarts place, they'd force him to sleep in a cell all by himself too. There was a sudden rap at the door. A short, cheerful tune, and it opened once more. Remus slouched even further in his seat as a friendly-faced boy with a mess of dark hair and large round glasses entered, grinning. "Hiya!" He held out a hand to Remus. "First year? Me too. I'm James." He nodded his head back to a short boy who'd followed him in. "This is Peter." Remus shook James's hand. It felt easy and comfortable. For the first time, the tight coil in his stomach began to unwind. "Remus." "Can we sit here? Everywhere else is full and Peter's getting train sick." "I'm not," Peter murmured, taking a seat opposite Remus, eyeing him warily. He did look a bit green. He rubbed his hands together in his lap and stared at the floor. "Know what house you'll be in?" James asked Remus directly. Remus shook his head. He didn't know anything about houses. Was that where they'd be sleeping? "What were your parents in?" James persisted. "Did they go to Hogwarts?" Remus nodded slowly. "My dad did. I don't know a house, though. My mum didn't. She was not a muggle." Peter looked up suddenly. "You're a half-blood?" Remus shrugged helplessly. "Shut up, Pettigrew," James chastised the boy next to him. "As if it matters." Remus was just about to ask what a half-blood was when the door opened yet again. It was the good-looking boy who'd sworn at him in the station. He glanced about furtively. "None of you are related to me, are you?" he drawled. He had the same high, upper-class accent that Peter and James had. Remus disliked them all at once, knowing that they'd think he was common, and a half-blood, whatever that was. "Don't think so," James replied, grinning. "James Potter." He held out a hand again. The other boy shook it easily. "Oh, good, a Potter. Dad told me not to talk to you." He sat down next to Remus, grinning. "Sirius Black." Chapter 3. First Year. The Sorting. Remus was fairly sure he was dreaming, or he'd drowned getting over that awful lake and this was just his brain making things up before he died. He was standing in an enormous stone hall the size of a cathedral. It was full of students, all dressed in identical black robes, apart from their ties, and lit by candles. Not just any candles. These candles were actually floating. He might have been able to live with that. It could have been a clever trick of the light, something to do with wires. But when he looked up, he almost yelled. There was no ceiling, just the vast night sky hanging over them, pendulous grey clouds and glittering stars. No one else seemed interested, save for the red-haired girl, Lily, and a few other kids Remus assumed must have Muggle parents too. Remus had on his uniform now and felt a little bit better to be dressed the same as everyone else. All the students sat on long banquet tables under their house banners. James had excitedly explained the differences between each house, much to the chagrin of Sirius and Peter, both of whom were convinced they'd end up in the wrong place. Remus didn't know whether to be nervous or not. He couldn't see how much it would matter to him. He'd probably get kicked out after his first lesson anyway. The more time Remus spent among wizards, the more he convinced himself he couldn't actually be one. Professor McGonagall, a thin, stern-faced witch who'd led all the first years into the hall, was now standing beside a stool, holding a mangy old brown hat. This was the test James had told them about. They had to put on the hat, then somehow they would each be sorted into one of the houses. Remus looked up at each of the banners. He already knew he wouldn't end up in Ravenclaw, not if he had to be clever. He didn't think much of the one with the badger. They weren't exactly exciting animals, especially compared to snakes. He liked the green colour too, if it came down to picking a tie. But then James and Peter had both been keen on Gryffindor, and seeing as they were the only people who'd been friendly so far, he wouldn't mind going with them. A boy called Simon Arnold was the first to be called forward. The hat was placed on his head, covering the top half of his face. Remus wondered if it smelled as bad as it looked. Matron was always maniacal about head lice, and he hoped none of the kids who went before him had them. Simon was promptly sorted into Hufflepuff, the Badger House, to tumultuous applause. Sirius Black was the first of their group to go, and he looked positively queasy as he approached the stool. There was some catcalling from the Slytherin table. 2 of the older students were calling out to him. 2 young women with masses of dark curls and the same high cheekbones and full lips as Sirius, who was now trembling on the stool. The hall was quiet for a few moments as the hat came to rest on Black's head. Then the hat screeched, "Gryffindor!" A few moments of stunned silence before the clapping came this time. McGonagall gently lifted the hat from Sirius's head and gave him a small, rare smile. He looked completely horrified, casting a desperate look at the Slytherin table, where the 2 girls heckling him were hissing, eyes narrowed. He got up and slowly walked over to the Gryffindors, where he was the first new student to take his place under the red and gold banners. The sorting continued. Lily was also placed in Gryffindor and sat grinning next to a very miserable-looking Sirius. When it was finally his turn, Remus still couldn't see what all the fuss was about. He didn't much like having everyone's eyes on him as he pushed to the front, but he did his best to ignore it. He would have shoved his hands in his jeans and slouched normally, but in his weird new uniform it didn't have the same effect. He sat on the stool, McGonagall looking down her nose at him. She reminded him a bit of Matron, and disgust rose in his throat. She lowered the hat over his eyes. Everything went dark. It didn't smell at all, and the peace and quiet was actually a bit of relief. A small voice spoke in his ear. It was the hat. Remus tried not to cringe as it purred quietly.
"You're an odd one, aren't you? What shall we do with you? Perhaps Ravenclaw? There's a good brain in there."
Remus flinched, feeling as if someone were playing a joke on him. Not bloody likely.
"But then," the hat considered, "you might go further. Much further if I put you in Gryffindor."
Remus ripped the hat from his head as soon as it had sorted him, not waiting for McGonagall to remove it. He hurried over to the Gryffindor table, barely registering the cheering and clapping as he passed. He sat opposite Lily and Sirius. Lily shot him a pleased smile, but he just sat and looked at his empty plate. By the time the peas came round, Remus had somewhat recovered and was able to watch with some interest as Peter, a small pudgy-looking boy, hurried toward the sorting hat. Peter was the sort of boy who wouldn't last 5 minutes at St. Eddie's. He had a perpetually nervous, twitchy look that the other boys always singled out. Remus was surprised that James, who was the polar opposite of Peter, relaxed and self-assured, brimming with confidence, was being so kind to someone so obviously inferior. The hat took a very long time over Peter. Even the teachers seemed to be getting nervous as the minutes ticked by. Finally he was sorted into Gryffindor, and much more quickly so was James, who strode over to the table with a huge grin on his face.
"How great is that?"
He addressed the other 3 boys.
"We all made it!"
Sirius groaned, his head and his arms on the table.
"Speak for yourself," he replied, slightly miffed. "My father's going to kill me."
"I can't believe it," Peter kept saying, eyes wide. Though he'd clearly got what he wanted, he kept wringing his hands and shooting looks over his shoulder as if someone might come over at any moment and ask him to try again. McGonagall did come over, but she placed a bony hand on Remus's shoulder. "Mr. Lupin," she said quietly, but not so quietly that the other boys couldn't hear, "if you would come to my office after dinner, it's next to the Gryffindor comment room. One of the prefects can show you." Remus nodded, mute, and she left. "What was that about?" James asked. "McGonagall wants to see you already?" Even Sirius looked up now, curious. Remus shrugged as if he didn't care either way. He knew what they were thinking. The rough kid was already in trouble. Sirius was looking at his black eye again. Fortunately, the food had appeared, distracting everyone. And it had really appeared. The previously empty places were suddenly laden with an actual feast. Golden roasted chickens, piles of crispy roast potatoes, plates of steaming carrots, peas swimming in butter, and an enormous jug of rich dark gravy. If the food was going to be like this all the time, then Remus wondered if he could ignore talking hats and snobbish housemates. He paid very close attention as one of the Gryffindor prefects, who introduced himself as Frank Longbottom, led the first years to their common room in one of the towers. Remus hated getting lost and tried hard to cement the journey in his mind as they went. He made a mental note of the size and shape of every door they entered, each portrait they passed, and which staircases moved. He was so tired and full of good food that the moving portraits and staircases no longer seemed out of place. Once they reached the right corridor, Remus saw McGonagall's office, marked with a neat brass plaque, and decided to get the meeting over with. He paused outside the door and was just about to knock when James appeared. "Want us to wait for you, mate?" "Why?" Remus asked, eyeing the dark-haired boy suspiciously. James shrugged. "So you don't end up on your own?" Remus stared at him for a moment before slowly shaking his head.
"No, I'm fine."
He knocked.
"Enter!"
A voice came from within. Remus pushed open the door. The office was small, with a neat little fireplace and rows of books against one wall. McGonagall sat behind an immaculately tidy desk. She smiled thinly and motioned for Remus to sit down in the chair opposite. He did, sniffing and rubbing his nose. "I'm pleased to meet you, Mr. Lupin," the teacher said in a reedy Scottish accent. Her hair was grey, pulled back in a severe bun, and she wore deep green robes secured with a golden clasp shaped like a lion's head. "I'm even more pleased to have you in Gryffindor House, of which I am the head." Remus didn't say anything. "Your father was in Ravenclaw, you know." Remus shrugged. McGonagall pursed her lips. "I thought it best to speak with you as soon as possible about your condition," she said quietly. "Dumbledore has explained that you've had minimal interaction with the wizarding world so far, and I feel it is my duty to let you know that people with your particular problem face a huge amount of stigma. Do you know what stigma means?" Remus nodded. He couldn't spell it, but he knew the word well enough. "I want you to know that as long as you're in my house, I will not tolerate anyone treating you differently or unkindly. That applies to all the students under my care. However," she cleared her throat, "it may be prudent for you to exercise caution."
"I wasn't going to tell anyone," Remus replied. "As if I want anyone knowing."
"Well, quite," McGonagall nodded, looking at him curiously. "That brings me to my next point. Arrangements have been made for the full moon, which occurs this Sunday, I believe. If you could report to me after dinner, I shall show you where to go. Perhaps you could tell your friends you're visiting someone at home." Remus snorted. He rubbed the back of his head.
"Can I go now?"
The professor nodded, frowning slightly. Outside, Remus found James still standing there, alone, waiting for him.
"Told you I'd be okay,"
Remus said, annoyed. James just smiled. "Yeah, but you missed Longbottom giving us the password. Do you want to be stuck out here all night? Come on." James led him to the end of the corridor where hung a large painting of a voluptuous woman wearing pink. "Widdershins," James said, and the portrait moved away, swinging out like a door. They entered the common room. There'd been a rec room at St. Edmund's Boys' Reformatory, but it was nothing like this. The room had been sparsely decorated, containing a black and white, too small TV and a few board games. The decks of cards were always incomplete, and most of the chairs were broken or damaged. The Gryffindor common room was warm, comfortable and cosy. There were huge, squashy-looking sofas and armchairs, a thick maroon rug in front of the blazing fire, and even more paintings adorning the walls. "We're up here," James said, leading Remus to a winding staircase in one corner. At the top there was another door which opened into a bedroom. Again, this was nothing like the facilities at St. Edmund's. There were 4 beds, all enormous, hung with thick red velvet curtains with gold-trimmed tassels. There was another fireplace, and each boy had a heavy mahogany trunk and set of shelves by their beds. Remus saw his sad little suitcase propped up against one of the trunks. He moved over, assuming that was his bed. Peter was rifling through his own things, pulling out clothes and magazines and books, making a terrible mess. "I can't find my wand!" he wailed. "Mum made me pack it so I wouldn't lose it on the train, but it's not here." "Pete," James grinned. "Your mum asked me to look after it, remember?" James and Peter, Remus had learnt since the train, had grown up as neighbours and knew each other quite well. The two boys couldn't be any more different, and Remus still didn't understand why James didn't want to beat the shit out of Peter. Sirius was sitting on his bed, his trunk still packed. "Cheer up, mate," James said, going to sit next to him. "You didn't want to be in Slytherin anyway, did you?" 500 years, Sirius replied stonily. "Every black at Hogwarts has been sorted into Slytherin for 500 years. "Well, it's about time someone tried to be different, eh?" James slapped him on the back jovially. Remus opened his trunk. Inside there was a large pewter cauldron, another item Dumbledore had scrounged up from the second-hand bin, he imagined. There was also a long, thin box at the top with a note on it. He unfolded the note and stared at the elaborate, swirly script for a long time, trying to make sense of it. He only recognized the word father and guessed that it was also from Dumbledore, but had belonged to his father. Opening it eagerly, he found a long, polished stick. It was a wand. He hadn't thought about wands yet, but he took it in his hand and squeezed the wood firmly. It was so warm to the touch, like his own flesh, and felt supple as he turned it in his hands. It felt good. Sirius finally started to unpack, pulling book after book out of his trunk. Those that didn't fit on his shelf he stacked beside his bed. James stared, having just finished pinning a poster next to his own bed. It showed a lot of little people zooming about on broomsticks, throwing balls to each other. Remus thought it looked only mildly more interesting than football, which he hated. "You know," James said to Sirius, still stacking books, "there is a library here." Sirius smirked. "I know, but these are mostly Muggle books. My Uncle Alphard left them to me, and Mum would set them all on fire if I left them at home." Remus's ears pricked at that. What was wrong with Muggle books? Not that he had any. He hated reading more than anything in the world. He didn't think about it for long, though, because now Sirius was lifting an actual record player out of his trunk, followed by a box of brand new-looking records in shiny bright sleeves. He went over to look straight away. "Is that Abbey Road?" he asked, peering into the box of vinyl. "Yeah," Sirius grinned, handing it to him. Remus wiped his hands carefully on his robes before taking it from him, handling it carefully. "You must be Muggle-born," Sirius said. "Never met a wizard who knows the Beatles, except for my cousin Andromeda. She bought them for me." Remus nodded, forgetting himself for a moment. "I love the Beatles. One of the boys in my room at home's got the last 10 singles, but he never lets me touch them." "Boys at home?" Sirius arched an eyebrow. Remus thought he seemed very grown up. "You mean your brother?" "No." Remus shook his head, handing back the record and shrinking away. "I live in a children's home." "Like an orphanage?" Peter asked, wide-eyed. Remus felt anger rising, his ears growing hot. "No!" he spat. He felt all the boy's eyes slide toward his bruise again and turned around to unpack the rest of his things in silence. Eventually, Potter and Black started up a conversation about something called Quidditch, which soon became a very heated argument. Remus climbed onto his bed and drew back the curtains, relishing the privacy. It was dark, but Remus was used to the dark. "You think he'd try harder to make friends," Peter whispered loudly to the other two boys. "Especially if he's Muggle-born." "Are you sure the hat wasn't supposed to put you in Slytherin?" Sirius drawled. Peter was quiet after that. Chapter 4, First Year, Full Moon. The author has included a warning that there is a homophobic slur used towards the end of the chapter. Sunday, the 5th of September, 1971. Remus got through the rest of the week by ignoring the other boys as much as he could. This was a technique he'd picked up on at St. Edmund's. It was better not to be noticed, and best if no one knew anything about you at all. He still got the odd dead arm or his head shoved in the bogs, but on the whole no one ever made an effort to bother him. James, Sirius, and Peter were not at all like the St. Eddie's boys, of course. They were what Matron would call well-bred. Sirius and James especially seemed to come from money. He could tell from the way they talked about their homes as well as the way they spoke, each vowel and consonant clearly pronounced. Remus listened carefully and resolved to stop dropping his H's. It wasn't just their accents, but what they said. Remus had grown up with adults constantly telling him to be quiet, and with boys who picked on you for being a swot if you said any more words than necessary. James and Sirius spoke like characters in a novel, their language so full of descriptive metaphor and scathing sarcasm. Their rapid-fire wit was much more intimidating than a punch in the face, Remus thought. At least that was over quickly. He'd so far avoided the other boys by going for walks round the castle. At St. Edmund's he'd had very little personal liberty, and spent much of his time locked in rooms. At Hogwarts it seemed there was nowhere you couldn't go, and Remus was determined to investigate every inch of the bizarre landscape. They'd been provided with maps to help them find their classrooms, but Remus found his sorely lacking and overly simplified. It did not list, for example, a secret passageway he'd found which led from the dungeons to the first-floor girls' loos. He had no idea why on earth anyone would need to get between the two, and the first time he used it he was accosted by a particularly irritating ghost who squirted him with hand soap. It would have also been helpful, Remus reasoned, to animate the map in the way the paintings were. Then at least you could keep track of the ridiculous moving staircases. He was sure one of the rooms moved as well. It never seemed to be quite in the same place. By the time Sunday afternoon rolled round, Remus was dreading Monday, which would not only be the first day after the full moon, but the first day of lessons. After dinner, which Remus spent alone, a few seats away from Sirius, James, and Peter, he made his way quickly to McGonagall's office. She was waiting for him, along with the school nurse who he'd been already introduced to. She was a kind, pleasant sort of woman, if a little fussy. "Good evening, Mr. Lupin," McGonagall smiled. "Thank you for being so prompt. Come along." To Remus's surprise, the two women led him not to the dungeons, as he thought they might, but outside the castle, towards a very large twisted tree. The Whomping Willow was a recent addition to the grounds. Dumbledore had explained in his speech at the beginning of the year that it had been donated by an ex-pupil. Remus thought that whoever had donated it must really hate the school, because the tree was not only terrifying in aspect, but mindlessly violent. As they approached, Professor McGonagall did something so incredible that Remus almost shrieked out in shock. She seemed to vanish, shrinking down suddenly until she was no longer there at all. In her place was a sleek, yellow-eyed tabby cat. Madame Pomfrey gave no sign that she was surprised, as the cat ran forward toward the tree, which was flailing its branches like a child having a tantrum. The cat was able to run right up to the trunk of the tree, escaping injury, and pressed a paw against one of the knots in the bark. The tree fell instantly still. Remus and Madame Pomfrey continued on, walking into a hollow beneath the tree, which Remus had never noticed before. Inside, McGonagall was waiting for them, a witch again. The passageway was dimly lit by torches giving off a greenish glow, and at the very end was a door. This opened into a small cottage which looked long abandoned. The windows were boarded up and the doors bolted. "Here we are." McGonagall tried to sound pleasant, though it seemed a very grim place. "Now, I hope you understand that we can't stay with you, but if you would like Madame Pomfrey to wait outside until the transformation is complete." Remus shrugged. "I'll be okay. How do I get back in the morning?" "I'll pop by as soon as the sun rises," Madame Pomfrey assured him. "Patch you up and give you off to your lessons before anyone even notices you're gone." She smiled, but her eyes looked sad. It made Remus uncomfortable. But then it was getting to that point in the evening when everything made him uncomfortable. His hair itched, his skin felt too tight, his temperature rose. "You better go," he said, quickly retreating into the bare room. There was a little cot against one wall with clean sheets. It looked as though it had been put there for him. The two women left, locking the door heavily behind him. He heard McGonagall muttering again and wondered what sort of spells she was placing on the house. Whatever they were, it was better than that awful silver plating. He sat on the bed for the moment, then got up again, restless. He paced the room. Sometimes it felt as though the wolf crept into his mind before it got a hold of his body, and as darkness fell outside, his senses became sharper. the hot swell of hunger beginning in his belly. Remus removed his clothes quickly, not wanting to rip them. A dull throb started in his joints and he lay down on the bed. This was the worst part. His heartbeat was thudding in his ears and he could swear he heard his tendons creaking as they stretched, his bones and teeth grinding against each other as they elongated, his skull splitting and reshaping. He groaned and hissed until the pain grew too much. Then he screamed. He could only hope that he was far enough away from the school that no one could hear him. All in all, it took about 20 minutes, though he never actually timed it. Things became foggy afterward. He couldn't always remember what happened once he became the wolf. That first night at Hogwarts was a blur, and he woke up with less injuries than usual. He suspected he'd sniffed around the unfamiliar territory, testing its boundaries. He must have tried to throw himself at the doors or windows at some point, because he had a patchwork of bruises down his left side for days afterward. Transforming back was just as unpleasant. A crushing, tightening feeling all over which left him breathless and aching. He wiped the tears from his eyes and crawled onto the cot, grateful for a quiet hour of sleep before the sun rose completely. Madame Pomfrey returned as promised. Speaking in soothing tones, she lay her cool hands on his fevered brow. "I don't like the look of you," she said as he opened his sleepy eyes. "It's madness thinking you can start a school day like this. You're exhausted." No one had ever expressed such concern for him before, and it struck him uneasily. He pushed her away, putting on his clothes. "I'm fine. I want to go." She made him drink something before letting him get up. It tasted cold and metallic, but he did feel better afterward. He hurried up to Gryffindor Tower to get his uniform on as fast as possible. He didn't want to miss breakfast. He was famished. "Where were you?" James accosted him as soon as he burst into the room. The 3 other boys were all up and dressed, looking immaculate, apart from James's hair, which always stuck up at the back. "Nowhere." Remus pushed past to get his things. "Are you okay?" Sirius asked, glancing away from the mirror where he was smoothing down his own hair. "Yeah," James added, watching Remus carefully. "You look a bit weird, mate." Remus scowled at them. "Piss off." "We're just being nice," Peter said, his hands on his hips. The 3 of them stared at Remus, who was just about to remove his t-shirt when he remembered his bruises. "What?" he growled at them. "You gonna watch me get dressed? You posh boys are a bunch of poofs." He marched into the bathroom with his clothes and slammed the door. After a few moments he heard Peter whining that he was getting hungry, and they all left. Chapter 5, First Year, Potions. Friday, the 10th of September, 1971. By the end of his first week of lessons, Remus had lost 10 house points, learnt 1 spell, and gained another bruise, this time on his chin. The first few lessons were okay. They were introductory, and while Lily Evans spent each class furiously scribbling down pages and pages of notes, no one else seemed to be bothered. There were set a few simple pieces of homework, but Remus had made a plan to pretend he'd forgotten to make a note of it if anyone asked. Charms was the most exciting. The tiny professor enchanted a pile of pine cones to whiz round the room, to everyone's delight. After a few goes at the spell themselves, Lily had levitated her pine cone at least 3 feet in the air, and Sirius got his to spin like a top, until it got out of control and smashed a window. James, Peter, and Remus had less luck, but Remus was sure his had jumped once or twice. Transfiguration was just as interesting, but much more serious, as it was led by Professor McGonagall. There would be no practical work at all during the first week, she explained, but she would be setting lots of homework in order to gauge their ability levels. History of magic was absolutely dire, and the less said about it the better. Remus struggled not to fall asleep as the ghostly Professor Binns floated up and down the aisles, reading off dates and names of battles. He too set homework. 2 chapters of reading from the set text. Sirius rolled his eyes at this and muttered to James, "Surely everyone's finished a history of magic. It's kids' stuff." James nodded, yawning. Remus felt sick. He hadn't opened even one of the books in his trunk yet, except to rip off the first page from Level 1 Potions to spit his chewing gum into. He'd actually been looking forward to potions, hoping to at least see something to blow up, like in chemistry. But that turned out to involve a huge amount of reading too, and even worse, they had to share the class with the Slytherin first years. The professor leading potions was annoyingly cheerful and took almost half an hour just to read the register.
Black? Sirius? Ah, there you are. Quite surprised at the sorting, my boy, quite surprised. I've had every single one of the blacks in my house since I started teaching. Shan't take it personally, though, young Sirius, but I shall be expecting great things.
Sirius looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him up. Slughorn continued calling out names.
A Potter and a Pettigrew, eh? Well, well, along with Mr. Black here, this class has quite the pedigree, Let me see. Lupin. I knew your father, not one of mine, but a damn good duelist. Nasty business.
Remus blinked. He wondered if Slughorn knew he was a werewolf. The whole class was looking at him. They knew by now he'd been raised in a children's home and that his father was magical. Remus suspected that Peter told them. But no one dared ask him much more. There seemed to be another rumour running round that he was violent and possibly in a gang. He was sure that James and Sirius were encouraging it too, though he found he didn't mind too much. Fortunately, Slughorn wanted to get them started on practical work as soon as possible.
Best thing is to just duck in, he smiled. Now, if we all work 4 to a cauldron, you can all take turns in order to follow the steps.
Everyone clamoured to pair up. James, Sirius, and Peter immediately claimed the cauldron at the very back of the room, and were joined by Nathaniel Quince, a Slytherin boy who knew Potter and Pettigrew from home. Remus decided he would just wait until everyone had grouped off, then see if he could get away with just hovering at the back for the rest of the lesson. No such luck.
"Remus, you can join us."
Lily grabbed his wrist and pulled him over to a cauldron she was sharing with Severus Snape, her long-nosed friend Remus had met on the train, and Garrick Mulciber, a brutish snub-nosed boy who Remus was a bit afraid of. Lily was chattering away happily, laying out all the ingredients and heating up the cauldron carefully. She was looking at Severus's book, which already had notes scribbled all over the margins.
"Here's the desiccated snail eye stems."
Lily shook a tiny jar.
"I think we need 1/4 of an ounce."
"You can be fairly liberal with them, Lily. They don't add too much overall," Severus drawled, sounding bored. Lily measured them out anyway and tipped them into the bubbling brew. Mulciber then took the book and stirred for 5 minutes, taking instruction from Severus on how fast to go and in which direction. Then it was Remus's turn. Lily gave him the book. He stared at the page. He could see that they were instructions. He could make out maybe half the words, but every time he thought he had a grasp on it, the letters seemed to shift on the page and he was lost all over again. His cheeks grew hot and he felt slightly sick. He shrugged, looking away.
"Oh, hurry up," Severus snapped. "It's not as if it's difficult."
"Leave him alone, Sev," Lily chided. "The book's covered in your notes. No wonder he can't find his place. Here, Remus."
She flicked open her own brand-new potions book. But it was no good. Remus shrugged. "Why don't you do it if you're so clever?" He spat at Severus.
"Oh, Merlin!"
Severus's lip curled.
"You can read, can't you? I mean, even Muggle schools teach that, surely."
"Severus!" Lily gasped, but the smug, dark-haired boy didn't have a chance to say anything else. Remus threw himself over the desk and into Severus, fists flying. He only had the element of surprise going for him. Mulciber grabbed his collar and yanked him back, punching him square in the face in 3 seconds flat.
"Stop!"
Slughorn boomed. Everyone froze. The portly potions master stormed over.
"Get up, both of you!"
he shouted at the 2 boys on the floor. Snape and Remus climbed to their feet, chests heaving. Snape looked worse by far, his hair ruffled and blood oozing from his nose. Remus had a rather sore chin where Mulciber had hit him, but other than a rumpled uniform, he was fine.
"Explain yourselves!"
Slughorn shouted. They both looked at their feet. Mulciber was grinning. Lily was crying.
"Very well,"
the teacher said crossly.
"Detention for both of you. 2 weeks. 10 points from Gryffindor and 10 from Slytherin."
"That's not fair," James said suddenly from the back.
Should be twice as many from Slytherin. It was 2 against 1.
From where I was standing, it was Mr. Lupin who started it,
Slughorn replied, but shook his head anyway.
Still, you are quite right. Mulciber, 5 points for punching Remus. Violence does not solve violence, you know, as I've told your eldest brother on a number of occasions. Miss Evans, please take Mr. Snape to the hospital wing. Lupin, you can clean up this mess you've made.
Remus didn't know any cleaning spells, so he had to mop up by hand. Slughorn even made him clean Snape's blood off the flagstones. Unfortunately, it being so soon after a full moon, the rich iron smell of it made his stomach growl. Sirius, James and Peter were waiting for Remus outside after the lesson was finished.
Bloody brilliant, mate!
James punched Remus lightly on the arm.
The way you just went for him! Mulciber was out there bragging afterwards. Told everyone what Snape said, Sirius added. You were right to do it. What a prat! Told everyone? Remus moaned.
Don't worry, they're all on your side, James said. Well, except the Slytherins.
Yeah, and who gives a toss about the Slytherins? Sirius grinned. Come on, it's dinner soon. Hungry? Starving, Remus grinned back.
Chapter 6. First Year. Revenge. So, James said on Sunday evening, how are we going to get them back? Get who back? Peter asked without looking up, searching through his notes for something. They were in the Gryffindor common room, trying to do their homework for McGonagall. 14 inches on the basic laws of transfiguration. Sirius and James had finished theirs. Peter was at least 6 inches in, and Remus hadn't started.
The Slytherins, James hissed. Keep up, Pete.
All the Slytherins? Peter asked, sounding worried. Only Snape and Mulciber, right?
All of them,
Sirius confirmed. He'd just appeared from under the desk they were sharing and presented a piece of parchment.
This what you were looking for?
Thanks! Peter grabbed it, relieved. I'm nearly finished.
Have you done it yet, Lupin?
Sirius looked over. Remus had opened his book but hadn't so much as looked at it. He'd even considered cloistering himself away in the library one evening and trying to read it properly. He could read if he really focused, but the opportunity hadn't presented, and if he was honest, he just didn't want to. Ever since the potions lesson, the 4 of them had become real friends, and Remus didn't want to miss out.
Nah,
he shrugged in response to Sirius.
Can't be bothered. Let us know if you need help.
You can copy mine if you want. James pushed his across the desk. Remus pushed it back, gritting his teeth.
I'm fine. I'm not stupid.
No one said you were, James replied casually. Sirius was looking at him, though. Remus wanted to hit him, but he was trying not to lash out so much. James and Sirius sometimes play wrestled, but they never actually tried to hurt each other, like he had with Snape. Forcing himself to swallow his temper, Remus opted instead to change the subject.
We could put itching powder in their beds,
he offered. Someone had done that to him once. He had a rash for a full week on the night of the full moon. He'd torn at his skin more than usual.
Or in their clothes, if we could figure out who does the laundry, anyway.
This had been a matter of great concern to Remus. Their dirty laundry had appeared to just vanish and then resurface, clean and folded in the trunks. He'd never caught anyone else in their room and couldn't understand it at all.
I like it,
James replied, chewing his quill. Anyone got itching powder, though? The 3 boys shook their heads.
Could order some from Zonko's, Sirius put in. If you let me borrow your owl, James, Mum confiscated mine after the sorting.
I suppose, James replied.
Wish we could do it sooner, though. You know, strike while the iron's hot. Don't need to buy itching powder, Remus said suddenly, having a brainwave. Do you reckon they have rose hips in the greenhouse?
Yep, Peter spoke, head still bowed over his homework. For healing potions. Arthritis, I think.
The hairs inside make you itch really badly, Remus explained excitedly. Matron, the woman who runs the children's home, she grows them, and if you get into trouble, she makes you seed them without gloves on.
His fingertips itched just thinking about it. That's awful, James said.
Good idea, though, Sirius grinned. Next break, we'll go get a load of them. Then we can seed them, with gloves on, and put them in the Slytherin's bed sheets. Excellent.
How are we going to get into the Slytherin dorms? Peter asked, finally finished with his work. Leave that to me, James said, mercurially. Getting the rose hips was easy. They sent Peter, who was the only one of them who hadn't been given a detention yet, and was therefore under the least observation. Peter was small and good at going unseen. He crept into the greenhouse unnoticed during morning break and returned red-faced and gleeful with a jar full of rose hips under his cloak. Then they'd all lock themselves away in their shared bedroom to seed all the buds. Under Remus's close instruction, they all wore their heavy dragonhide gloves to do this, taking extra care not to touch the seeds or the fine little hairs.
I can't wait to see the looks on their faces.
Sirius was grinning, sitting cross-legged on the floor next to James. Remus watched, sitting on the edge of the bathtub, James and Sirius's two dark heads bowed over their work. He was a bit jealous of their friendship. They had so much in common, being raised into magic, both growing up wealthy, both completely mad about Quidditch. In addition, it was clear that after only 3 weeks, Sirius and James had managed to secure a reputation as joint kings of the first years. Everyone listened to them when they spoke. Everyone laughed when they were funny. No one even got annoyed if they lost house points.
I still don't know how we're going to get into the Slytherin dorms. Even Peter isn't that sneaky.
Sirius glanced at James. He'd been trying to get him to reveal his plan ever since the bespectacled boy had mentioned it. "Let me worry about that," was all James would say. The seeds and hairs were then decanted into another jar, while the boys ended up eating the leftover rose hips over the course of the week. It was Tuesday evening when they finally had their chance. James decided that they would have to do it before everyone went to bed. He also decided they ought to go to the Slytherin dorm separately to avoid being seen together and discovered. Remus personally thought this was overkill, but went along with it, not wanting to ruin the other boys' fun. They ate dinner much more quickly than usual that evening, for getting up from the table one at a time and leaving the hall. Peter looked so nervous Remus thought he might panic at the last minute and give them all away. He made sure to stay close to the smaller boy, just in case he had to cover his mouth or pull him back at some point. Sirius and James went first, of course, heading toward the girls' loos on the second floor, which Remus had told them led to the dungeon. He thought about keeping that particular passageway to himself, but as he'd already found a few other good hiding places, he reasoned that letting them know about this one couldn't hurt. After all, how often would he want to get to the dungeons? The ghost who lived in the toilets was fortunately in a quiet mood, though Remus could hear her sobbing softly in the last stall. "Lead the way then, Lupin," James gestured grandly once Remus and Peter had arrived. Sirius grabbed his arm. "Wait, show us what you're planning first." James smirked that annoying grin he'd been sporting since Sunday. "Oh, okay then. Here, hold this." He thrust the jar of rosepip seeds into Sirius's hands, pulling back his robes. He produced a very long, voluminous cloak woven from the strangest-looking fabric Remus had ever seen, silvery grey and shimmery.
"No," Sirius gaped. "You haven't got... Potter, you haven't bloody got..."
James was grinning so broadly now that Remus thought his face might split in two. The gangly boy winked at them all, then, with a flourish, swept the cloak over his head so that it covered him top to toe. He vanished.
"You jammy bastard!" Sirius whooped. "How come you never told me?"
"You never told me either," Peter squeaked. "And I've known you forever. Where'd you get it?" James pulled the hood of the cloak down so that his head appeared to float in mid-air. It made Remus feel a bit queasy. "Been in the family for years," he said triumphantly. "Dad let me bring it, as long as I don't tell Mum."
"Lucky git,"
Sirius said, grabbing for some of the invisible material and rubbing it between his fingers.
"My parents would do anything for an invisibility cloak."
"I reckon we can all fit under it," James demonstrated, pulling it apart and raising his arms like a bat. "Come on, let's all get nice and cozy." They all shuffled beneath the cloak, then tried waddling up and down the room a few times until they were able to walk comfortably together. Finally, trying not to giggle or whisper too much, the 4 invisible boys made their ways to the dungeon. Remus showed them which tiles to tap in order for the floor to open up in the third stall from the left.
"How'd you find this, Remus?"
James whispered.
"It's genius." "You come out behind one of them rugs they hang on the walls in the dungeons," Remus replied. "I just looked behind it."
"Do you mean a tapestry?" Peter asked.
Suppose so?"
Remus was glad none of them could see his face.
"Shut up, Pettigrew,"
Sirius snapped. Remus felt a sharp kick on the back of his ankle.
"Oi!"
he hissed, kicking back twice as hard.
"Bugger off!"
"Sorry," Sirius yelped.
"Meant to get Pete, not you." "Be quiet, all of you," James snapped. "We're almost there."
They waited quietly on their side of the tapestry, listening for footfalls in the corridor outside. Once James was satisfied that it was all quiet, they all clambered out from the passage. The dungeons were cool, dimly lit and cavernous. There was a strange dripping sound coming from somewhere. Perhaps the pipes.
"Where's the entrance?"
Sirius murmured.
"Behind that wall."
Remus pointed, hoping they could see what he was aiming at. It was a plain brick wall.
"How do you know?"
"I've seen them go in before," Remus said hurriedly. He wasn't going to tell them that he knew there were 200 Slytherins on the other side because of the scent of their blood and their magic.
"Do you know the password?"
"Nope."
"Damn. It's not curfew yet, let's just wait."
So they did, rather uncomfortably. Though the corridor was dank, it was unusually warm underneath the cloak, especially with all four of them so close together. Fortunately, 2 seventh years came hurrying through in the next few minutes. Unfortunately, Sirius knew them.
"Let's see the ring again, Bella,"
Narcissa Black pleaded with her elder sister. Remus felt Sirius stiffen, pressing himself against the wall. Bellatrix preened, extending a long ivory arm. On her bony finger was an enormous, ugly silver and emerald engagement ring, which she'd been flashing about since the start of term. Everyone in the school knew that she would be marrying Rudolphus Lestrange, some wizard politician, as soon as she completed her NEWTs. Sirius had to go to the wedding. Narcissa squealed when she saw it, though she'd probably seen it more than anyone else.
"Gorgeous,"
she gushed.
"Oh, I can't wait to get married."
"Wait your turn," Bellatrix replied, with a voice like nails on a chalkboard.
"Once Lucius has a better position with the ministry, I'm sure Mummy and Daddy will agree to the match."
The 2 young women were standing before the brick wall now. Bellatrix was the taller of the 2, but they looked very much alike. They had long, black, curly hair, much like Sirius himself, and that same perfect black family bone structure.
"Mundus sanguine,"
Bellatrix announced. The wall slid aside to let them in, and the 4 boys hurried after as fast as possible before it closed. For the first time since he'd been at Hogwarts, Remus was truly glad he'd been placed in Gryffindor. The differences between their warm, comfortable common room and that of the Slytherins was stark. It was built like an enormous banquet hall rather than a sitting room. The walls were richly decorated with yet more elegant tapestries. The fireplace was huge and ornately carved, and a ghoulish green pallor hung over everything. More than that, the place felt somehow wicked. Remus tried not to shudder. The other boys seemed as uneasy as he was, and they all froze still until James prodded them forward, up a flight of steps which they all hoped led to the boys' dormitories. On their way they passed Severus, sitting alone in a corner, hunched over his potions book. At the top of the stairs they entered the first door, which was, thankfully, a bedroom. James threw off the cloak. "Keep a lookout, eh, Petey?" he said, hurrying into the room. "Reckon which one of these is Snape's bed?"
"This one might be," Sirius pointed. "Sheets look greasy enough."
All 4 boys snickered.
"Quick then, lads, gloves on,"
James whispered, unscrewing the jar. Remus and Sirius pulled out a dragonhide glove each and grabbed handfuls of seeds and began scattering them underneath the bedclothes.
"They'll see them,"
James said, sounding disappointed. It was true, the bright red little seeds stood out clearly against the white sheets, even in the dark.
"Well, they'll still get it on 'em, trying to brush 'em off." "Hang on."
Remus had a sudden idea. He didn't know how it occurred to him or why, but somehow he just was sure it would work. He pulled out his wand, bit his lip, waved it gingerly over the bed he'd just scattered with seeds.
obfuscate,
he whispered. And just like that, the seeds were gone. Well, he knew they were still there, but no one else would be able to see them now.
Blimey,
James stared.
how did you do that?
Flitwick hasn't taught us that charm yet, has he? Was it in the reading?
No,
Remus shrugged.
I saw some 5th years doing it yesterday to some sweets they brought into the village, so not hard to copy.
Sirius and James immediately attempted it themselves over the seeds they'd just scattered. It didn't work the first time, the second, but after the third, James had managed to vanish most of his. You better do it, Lupin, or be in here all night, he decided.
Yes, please hurry up,
Peter hissed from the doorway, white with fear. Sirius tried a few more times before giving up and letting Remus take over.
You're going to have to show me exactly how to do that as soon as we're back on neutral territory,
he said. Remus nodded, though he wasn't sure how to explain it. He really had just done it because he thought he probably could. Next room, James announced, pulling them back to the entranceway. Do we have to? Peter asked, hopping from foot to foot. Isn't that enough?
Not even close,
Sirius replied with a laugh, tossing his head.
What if we haven't even got Snape's bed yet? We have to get them all, Pete. Are you with us or not?
All the boys, anyway, James said as they entered the next bedroom. I don't fancy our chances getting into the girls. Remember what happened to Dirk Cresswell last week? They worked quickly and managed to get every single boy's room, even the last one, which had 3 sleeping students in it, 6 years. Even Sirius had begged off going in there, but Remus was giddy with the excitement of the prank now, and threw on the invisibility cloak to go in himself. He even scattered the rose hips over the pillows of the sleeping boys. By the time they'd finished, it was getting late, and more Slytherins were heading upstairs for bed. Barely able to contain their glee, the 4 Gryffindors hid under their cloak and slowly crept back down the stairs, flattening themselves against the wall any time someone was coming, then through the enormous stately common room and out through the wall they'd come in. As James had instructed, they all kept as quiet as possible until they were within spitting distance of Gryffindor Tower, and it was finally safe to remove the cloak once more. Widdershins! They all chattered at the fat lady, who swung open for them. It was bliss to be back in the warm, bright Gryffindor common room, and they all threw themselves onto the nearest available sofa, grinning insanely at each other. Frank Longbottom called to them from his desk where he was tidying up revision notes. Cutting it fine, lads? Been somewhere interesting? Peter looked uncertain, but James just waved a hand. Library, obviously. Frank shook his head, though he was smiling. I'm sure I'll hear about that soon enough.
I wish I could be there when it all kicks off,
Sirius whispered, his eyes shining with joy.
And I wish even more that we could have got my cousins.
Oh, it's just the beginning, Sirius, mate, James replied, slapping the other boy's knee. Between the 4 of us, I reckon we could go even bigger next time. Excellent first mission, men. Peter whimpered. First mission? Chapter 7. First Year. Marauders. Wednesday, 15th of September, 1971. The next morning, James and Sirius could barely contain their excitement and hurried their dorm mates down to breakfast before any of the other Gryffindors. They were the first students to reach the Great Hall, other than a few Ravenclaws bent over their NEWT revision books with huge mugs of black coffee.
Perfect,
Sirius beamed at the empty benches.
Front row seats.
But no one shows up for hours, Peter groaned, half asleep, propped up on his elbows. Oh, cheer up. James poured them all large mugs of tea. Don't you want to see the fruits of our labour?
Not at 6 in the morning,
Peter replied, slurping his tea. Sirius winced at the sound and pushed a plate toward him.
Have some toast and stop whining.
Remus took some toast too and cut it into 4 pieces. He spread marmalade onto 1 quarter, jam onto another, butter on the third, and lemon curd on the last. He ignored the look of amusement Sirius was giving him. Remus had never had so much choice before and was determined to make the most of every meal. Fortunately, they did not have to wait too long before the other students began to trickle in for breakfast. The first Slytherins arrived just as Remus was finishing his toast. 3 boys and 2 girls, 3rd years. They walked over to their table, quite unaware of the 4 eager Gryffindors watching them intently. For a few moments it was as if nothing was different. Sirius sighed with disappointment. But then the tallest boy shuffled slightly in his seat, rubbing his arm. Another seemed to be looking for something in his pocket, but from Remus's viewpoint he was clearly scratching his leg furiously. The third kept using his wand to rub behind his ear.
"It worked,"
James whispered, breathless with excitement. Even Peter looked cheerful now. As more and more Slytherins filtered in, their problem became more obvious, and more hilarious. By 7 o'clock, the Slytherin table was full of squirming, writhing, scratching boys and horrified-looking girls. Amicus Carrow, a burly 6-year, eventually ripped off his robes, his school jumper, and even his tie to claw at his chest, which Remus could see was already red raw. He almost felt sorry for them. But then Snape came in. Whether it was karma or sheer luck, Severus seemed to have reacted particularly badly to the rosehip seeds. He walked in with his head bowed, hair falling over his face, but his nose was still visible and clearly bright red.
"Oh, Merlin!"
Sirius wheezed, laughing so hard he was holding his stomach.
"Tell me we got his face."
"Boy, Snivelus!" James yelled out suddenly to get the other boys' attention. Snape spun round, looking up, his hair parted. The left side of his face was covered in an angry red rash, from his temples all the way down to his neck, disappearing under his uniform. His left eye was red too, the lids swollen and irritated.
"Looking good,"
Sirius crowed, and all 4 boys dissolved into giggles as Snape stormed out of the room. By the time breakfast was over, the entire castle was buzzing with rumours about what exactly had come over the Slytherin boys. Sirius and James looked as though all their Christmases had come at once, and even Peter had cheered up remarkably, reminding them all that he had kept lookout after all, making the venture possible.
"It was all Lupin's idea, though,"
Sirius returned, slapping Remus heartily on the back.
"What shall we do to celebrate, eh? Exploding snap? Raid the kitchens?"
Remus shook Sirius off, smiling politely.
"Well, whatever you do, you're doing it without me," he replied. "We've got double detention." "From Slughorn?" "Yeah, and McGonagall. And Flitwick, but that's tomorrow. Then my herbology detention is over the weekend."
"Bloody hell, mate," James frowned. "You going for a record or something?" Remus shrugged. He was always being punished at St. Edmund's. All the boys were. Detention didn't bother him, though exploding snap did sound like a lot of fun.
"Maybe you'd better get started doing your homework,"
Sirius said gently. Remus rolled his eyes, getting up from the table.
"Come on," he said. "It's Defense Against the Dark Arts first. Thought you two loved that."
Later that day, Remus was on his way to his detention with Slughorn when he ran into Lily Evans. He was perfectly happy to keep walking, but she smiled and fell in step with him.
"Hiya, Remus."
"Hi."
"Are you going to the dungeons?"
He nodded.
"Me too. I have to tell Slughorn that Severus can't make his detention."
"Oh, right."
"Did you hear what happened to the Slytherins?"
"Yeah."
Everyone had heard. It was all they'd been talking about all day, even during lessons. Fortunately, no one had a clue who'd done it yet. It had been a good idea, attacking the whole house at once. Who could guess who the target had been?
"Crazy, isn't it?"
Lily continued.
"Poor Sev was allergic to whatever they used. Madame Pomfrey gave him a sleeping draught while the swelling goes down."
Remus sniggered without thinking. He glanced at Lily, who was looking at him with reproachful green eyes. She shook his head.
"Look, I know he wasn't very nice to you, the other day in potions or on the train. He's a bit of a snob, okay?"
Remus snorted.
"But I wanted to say sorry," Lily pressed on. "I need to stand up to him more. I shouldn't let him get away with it. He's actually a really nice person when you get to know him."
"If you say so."
Remus stopped walking. They were outside Slughorn's office now. The door was closed, and there were raised voices on the other side.
"Horace, whoever it was, they must have been a Slytherin."
It was Professor McGonagall.
"Who else has the password?"
"Why would a Slytherin attack their own house, Minerva?"
The potions master sounded very frustrated.
"You did say it was only the boys' dorms affected. Perhaps it was one of the girls."
"Really?"
"Well, who else? Peeves? He never enters the common rooms. Doesn't enter the dungeons either, come to that. Too frightened of the bloody Baron.
We ought to place a ban on all Zonko's products.
From what Poppy says, it wasn't a Zonko's product. Rose hip from the greenhouses.
Lupin felt a trickle of fear run down his spine. If they knew that much, would they be able to find out who'd done it?
Rosehip, eh? Very clever.
Slughorn actually sounded impressed. McGonagall sighed.
I suppose you'd like to blame the Ravenclaws now.
I just wish I knew who'd done it.
He sighed heavily.
Perhaps the truth will out. I suppose it does seem more likely that it was one of the Slytherin girls than
a gang of marauders creeping around into the dungeons under the cloak of night with malicious intent.
Remus could hear Slughorn chuckle at that.
Yes, quite.
Now I must be going,
McGonagall was saying, her footsteps approaching the door.
You will let me know if you catch the culprit.
The door swung open. Remus and Lily stepped back guiltily. McGonagall looked down at them through her spectacles.
What are 2 Gryffindors doing so far away from the tower? Please, Professor, Remus and I, we were only...
Ah!
Slughorn cut off Lily's nervous rambling.
Lupin, my boy, and Miss Evans, come to offer Snape's apologies, eh? No need, dear girl, no need. With everything going on today, I think we can cancel the boys' detentions for now.
He came to the door and looked down at Remus severely.
Is it understood that there will be no more fighting in my classes, or any classes for that matter,
Yes, Professor. Remus nodded solemnly, trying not to look too pleased.
Excellent,
Slughorn beamed, locking the door to his office.
Then if you'll excuse me, I have some inquiries to make.
Remus and Lily had almost made it to the end of the hall when McGonagall suddenly called out.
Mr. Lupin!
Remus's heart sank.
Yes, Professor McGonagall?
That isn't to say that your detention with me has been cancelled. Come along, we'll get an early start.
McGonagall had him doing lines for an hour. Not too bad, considering that he was used to canings at St. Edmund's. He didn't mind copying and repetition. It was soothing. I will complete all assignments set. Perhaps he'd swallow his pride next time and copy James's homework. Or Peter's if he didn't want to look too suspicious. But he knew that James would eventually want to know why Remus never read the set text, and if he told him, then he was equally sure that James and Sirius would try to get him to explain to McGonagall. Both boys had unerring faith in the teachers of Hogwarts. Remus, however, had never met an adult he'd trusted. She'd sent him back to St. Edmund's at once. What good was an illiterate wizard to anyone? Once his detention was finished, he climbed through the portrait hole and into the common room to find his 3 roommates waiting for him. Peter and James were engaged in a very serious-looking game of chess. Of course the pieces are moving, Remus thought to himself. Everything has to move in this bloody castle. While Sirius was listening to one of his records through a very posh-looking brand-new headphones. Remus was dying to have a listen, but he hadn't worked up the courage to ask yet. He sat down next to Sirius quietly. The long-haired boy pulled his headphones off at once and said,
That was quick.
I only had to do one in the end, Remus explained.
Slughorn let me off. Too busy trying to sort out the itching powder thing.
Sirius grinned broadly, leaning back on the couch with his arms folded under his head.
That prank is just the gift that keeps on giving. Snape was allergic and everything,
Remus said, smirking.
That ginger girl said he's been in the hospital wing all day.
Sirius laughed even louder. His eyes grew bright when he laughed. Remus had never seen anyone exhibit such pure joy. It made you want to punch him and be his friend at the same time. Which ginger girl? James looked up suddenly.
Checkmate,
Peter cried.
You know, the annoying one, Evans.
I don't think she's annoying.
Okay,
Remus shrugged.
Let's not talk about girls.
Sirius rolled his eyes.
This might be the most important day of our lives. This is the day we become legends. The day our friendship was forged in the fires of itching powder.
They don't know it was us, do they? Peter asked nervously, tidying away his chess set. Remus shook his head.
Slughorn reckons it was a Slytherin girl, or a gang of marauders. Marauders!
Sirius sat up suddenly.
That's it! Raise your glasses, boys!
We don't have glasses, James replied, amused.
Well, just pretend. Sirius shook his head irritably. From this day forward, we are the Marauders.
He said this with such a dramatic flourish that it could only be followed with a stunned silence. James was grinning, Peter glancing at him for direction, not quite understanding what was going on. Remus burst out laughing.
What sort of Ponzi gang name is that?
Chapter 8. First Year. Secrets. Tuesday, 5th of October, 1971. The next full moon passed much as the first had. This time the wolf had clearly grown restless because Remus awoke with a number of deep scratches.
They heal fast with a bit of antiseptic,
he advised Madame Pomfrey, who fussed over him in the chill morning light.
And faster still with magic,
she smiled with a flourish of her wand. The cuts closed up almost instantly. Remus stared, amazed.
Can you get rid of the scars too?
He asked eagerly. She shook her head sadly.
No, Remus, not these ones, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
He sighed, dressing for school. This time he brought his change of clothes with him and left them in the tunnel just outside the shack to avoid having to go back to the tower this time. He'd meet the other boys in their first lesson and let them wonder where he'd been.
You don't have to go to school today, Madame Pomfrey was saying. Not if you're too tired. I can write you a note.
I want to go, he replied. It's not that bad, honestly.
Pomfrey looked at him with serious eyes.
Not that bad for now. I'm afraid the transformations may start to take their toll as you grow up.
Have you looked after other kids like me, then?
He'd been wanting to ask for ages, but wasn't sure how.
No, dear, you're the first Hogwarts student that I know of who's been...
Bitten?
Who's been bitten, she accepted gratefully. But I promise I know what I'm doing. I've done plenty of reading on the subject.
You mean there are books about people like me?
Well, yes.
She sounded surprised. She sat down on the bed as he finished dressing.
You could borrow them if you like.
He thought about it, then shook his head. They had Transfiguration first thing, but McGonagall didn't give him detention for not bringing his homework. She'd obviously decided to be more lenient round the full moon. She did make him promise to bring it with him next time, and he agreed, hoping he sounded sincere. James, Sirius, and Peter spent half their lesson trying to get his attention, but he steadfastly ignored them until McGonagall threatened to separate all four of them. In the halls on their way to Charms, Remus knew there was no escape. It was a good 5-minute walk.
So, where were you?
Sirius blurted out, walking on his left-hand side.
Nowhere,
he replied, trying to hurry on.
Oh, go on,
James pleaded, coming up on his right-hand side.
Tell us, was it the same place you went last month?
Maybe.
Were you in detention again?
Asked Peter, struggling to keep up. Remus cursed himself for not having thought of that. Detention would have been the perfect cover.
Nope.
Then, where... Watch it, half-blood. Remus had been too busy evading questions to look where he was going, and had run smack into Snape, who was coming round the corner. Already wound up, Remus squared his shoulders and attempted to push past roughly.
Watch yourself, Snivelus.
Snape didn't move and pushed him instead, Mulciber appearing at his left shoulder, looming menacingly over the smaller boys.
I know it was you that broke into our dorms the other night, he hissed.
All of you.
Yeah? Prove it,
James smirked, folding his arms. Snape's lip curled.
I can't yet, but I will. I'll get you back too, I promise.
We're quaking in our boots,
Sirius replied, leaning against the wall as if he were bored.
Now, would you kindly move it?
Your idea, was it, Black? Snape drawled. Or yours, Potter? Had to have been one of you. Pettigrew doesn't have the guts, and dear Lupin here clearly hasn't got the brains.
Remus clenched his fist. He could see Snape's hand on his wand. Severus probably knew all sorts of curses and hexes. James had taught Remus one or two, but he was too blind with rage to remember any of them now.
"Move along now, gentlemen." A sharp voice suddenly rang over the corridor. It was Professor Flitwick stepping out of his classroom to see what the hold-up was. "Severus,
You're clogging up the halls, and you four are supposed to be in my class. Come along. Remus felt overheated and agitated for the rest of Charms, which was usually his favourite lesson. It relied more on practical work with his wand than reading or writing, and he often did better than even James and Sirius. Finding it difficult to calm down, he kept shooting his cushions across the room like missiles, rather than guiding them carefully through the hoops Flitwick had hung from the ceiling. They'd been working on levitation charms for a few weeks now, and Peter was the only one still struggling. In Remus's opinion, Peter's problem was a lack of imagination. James and Sirius were both unerringly confident, and he'd found that confidence was all you needed to complete most basic spells. Remus himself generally felt able to complete any task if it looked simple enough. Peter, on the other hand, worried about everything. He read and reread his textbooks, trying to copy the complicated diagrams rather than just copy what Flitwick showed them. "I expect you all to be able to levitate this book by the end of next week," Flitwick said at the end of the lesson. The book was enormous, about half the size of the tiny professor, and looked as though a fully grown man might have trouble carrying it very far. "So come prepared for a quick test of your abilities." Peter groaned as they collected their things to leave. Remus had managed to calm down by lunchtime, but still had trouble controlling his magic later in the afternoon, and was glad they only had herbology and history of magic. He wondered whether it was his temper, which had always been short, or whether it was the full moon. He always had a lot of energy after a transformation, even before he knew he could do magic. Now his wand buzzed in his hand like static on a TV aerial. He tried a quick Lumos, hiding in a toilet cubicle between lessons, and nearly burnt his retinas out. Perhaps the book Madame Pomfrey had mentioned might tell him more about it, but he'd never know now. There might be other books in the library, but he hadn't checked. He knew the word well enough, and could spell it out if he concentrated hard enough, but he didn't dare. Remus lived in fear that if he wrote it down or said it aloud, then somehow everyone would find out his secret, and it was just better to keep stuff like that in your head. Thursday, 7th of October, 1971. It was especially important to keep his secrets to himself now because Remus was being watched. By McGonagall, who still raised an eyebrow when she saw he wasn't taking notes, by Madame Pomfrey, who was always trying to get him to stop by the hospital wing for a quick check-over, and by Snape, who was still furious that he couldn't figure out how the itching powder incident had happened. Remus might have been able to bear all these interferences if it wasn't for a fourth person observing him. This stalker was much subtler, much less direct in his surveillance, but notable nonetheless. Sirius. At first, Remus thought the other boy was just nosy, part of the entitlement that he and James shared. They had to know everything about everybody. They were constantly telling Remus and Peter other people's business. So-and-so's father was turned down for a promotion at the ministry years ago, and that's why they've got that chip on their shoulder. Miranda Thrupp's great-aunt was once under investigation for the illegal use of a love potion, and now no one ever drank the tea at Thrupp's house. Professor Slughorn knew more about the dark arts than he let on, and the Slug Club was notorious for turning out dark wizards with influence. Of course, neither of them knew anything about Remus, and in the beginning he assumed this was why Sirius was so watchful. But he never asked any direct questions, and if he was curious about Lupin's family or upbringing, then it was a private interest that James did not share. James rarely watched other people, Remus had noticed. He preferred other people to be watching him. No one else seemed to notice, thankfully. Sirius was sly in that respect. Only very occasionally Remus managed to catch him unawares, staring intently with those deep blue eyes. He didn't even have the shame to look away when he was caught, only softened his gaze into a friendly smile, which Remus was obliged to return. That Thursday they were finishing their homework in the Gryffindor common room. Well, James was finishing Remus's homework, having completed his own. He offered to do it in return for Remus teaching him the obfuscate spell, and despite his pride, Remus had acquiesced. He really didn't want another detention with McGonagall, and James was good at imitating other people's handwriting. Sirius was completing his own essay and had already written 3 extra inches on the use of lacewing flies in transformative drafts, plus diagrams. There were books strewn all over the table they'd claimed for themselves, along with inkwells and scrunched-up rolls of parchment. Peter was trying to levitate an apple and get it into a wastepaper basket 4 feet away. So far he could get it up into the air, but then it wobbled and fell back down again. Frazzled, Peter ran his fingers through his hair again and consulted his text. "You'll get it, Pete, don't worry,"
James muttered, not looking up from Remus's paper. Keep at it.
I'm trying, Peter whined. I'm not sure if it's the movement I'm getting wrong. The book says to use a smooth serpentine action, but I'm not sure.
He swirled his wand in the air. Remus tutted. It's not like that, he said bluntly. It's like an S shape on its side, look. He performed the spell, effortlessly lifting the apple into the air and sent it sailing into the bin neatly.
An S shape? Are you sure?
Peter frowned. He aimed his own wand at a scrunched-up ball of paper from the table.
Wingardium Leviosa,
he chanted, waving his wand in the same way Lupin had. Sure enough, the paper flew shakily upwards, then flew with slightly less grace into the bin, bouncing off the sides as it fell to the bottom and landing beside the apple. Peter stared wide-eyed.
I did it,
he gasped.
An S shape. Why didn't it say that in the book?
Well done, Pete, James said, looking up and smiling. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. You should be a teacher, Remus. Lupin snorted, looking away bashfully. James continued. I'm nearly done with this. Just need to check something. Can you pass me Magical Theory, the waffling book? Remus felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Trying not to panic, he looked down at the pile of books James was pointing at. One of them was definitely about potions. It had a cauldron on the cover. The others, it was anyone's guess. The gold and silver lettering on each seemed to either shift and swirl before his eyes. Was it better to just pick one up, even if it was the wrong one? He looked back at James desperately, who was reading over what he'd written. Peter was too busy levitating more balls of paper to notice Remus's turmoil. He looked down again, biting his lip. Sirius cleared his throat quietly and leaned across the desk. He silently tapped one of the books with his forefinger without looking at Remus. It was a big black leather-bound tome which Remus recognized vaguely. Gratefully, he snatched it up and handed it to James. Cheers, mate, James said absent-mindedly, returning to his work. Sirius carried on as if nothing had happened. Remus felt his cheeks burning. Chapter 9. First Year. Scars. Note: mention of child abuse toward the end of the chapter. 15th of October, 1971. Remus had to spend the next few days avoiding Sirius, or at least avoiding being alone with him. This wasn't easy. The boys spent all their time together, especially on the weekends. They all got through the Friday charms lesson with no trouble, even Peter. Flitwick was thrilled that the entire class had mastered levitation so early in the year that he let them out early for lunch. Sirius made himself unavoidable the very next week, during their flying lesson. If Remus hadn't hated history of magic so much, then flying would have been his least favourite subject. 20 minutes into their first lesson with Madame Hooch, he'd learned that he was afraid of heights, and the rest of the classes had been miserable for him. James was the star of the class, of course, and even the other Marauders found him insufferable as he flitted around the Quidditch pitch, throwing loops and fients as if he were born on a broom. Sirius was excellent too, and most of the other kids in the class had grown up playing on broomsticks. Even Peter was competent. It had rained the night before, and the ground was soft and muddy. They changed out of their usual lace-up shoes and into thick boots and scarlet flying kits before squelching out onto the pitch. They picked up their brooms and waited instruction. The brooms were provided by the school. First years weren't allowed to bring their own, but James would tell anyone who stopped long enough to listen that he had a top-of-the-line model at home.
Right, mount your brooms, please, ladies and gentlemen, Hooch bellowed at the group. Nice strong wind today, so I want you all to take good care. Potter, no showing off.
Remus clambered onto his broom, swallowing hard. If he could manage not to be sick, then it would be a victory.
I'd like 5 clean laps around the pitch, then a good landing back here for each of you. Mind the puddle and remember to lean into the wind when possible. Use it to your advantage. 5 points to whoever's back first.
And then, with barely any warning, the silver-haired witch blew her whistle hard. Remus and Lily, the only 2 muggle-borns in the class, were the last off the ground. Once the redhead was in the air, however, she streaked ahead with ease.
Bit higher, Lupin, come on now.
Hooch boomed from below, shouting through a megaphone. He wanted to ignore her, but there was no escape.
At least back at St. Edmund's, when they made you do cross-country, you could hide round the corner and skive off in town for the afternoon. He pushed himself higher, trying to look ahead and not down, trying to think about anything other than the empty space between him and the ground. He could see Lily's bright red plate flashing ahead like a fox's tail, Peter's shining blonde hair somewhere in the middle of the group. Though he couldn't see that far ahead, he knew that James and Sirius were almost neck and neck. Remus just ploughed on grimly, not wanting to go any faster. Who cared if he was last, if he didn't break his neck getting there? As he rounded a corner at the end of the pitch, the wind really hit him, and he tried not to slow down too much, leaning forward. It was so cold, and the grey morning air battered his face. The second lap was as bad as the first. By the third, he noticed that James had taken to circling each of the towers and the empty spectator stands, despite Madame Hooch's admonishments. On the fourth lap, Remus had company.
"Having fun?"
Sirius grinned, cruising along beside him. He looked so comfortable, as if he could raise both hands over his head, spin upside down, and fly backwards without any trouble at all.
"What are you doing?"
Remus frowned, trying to ignore him.
"Trying to lose?" "James is going to win,"
Sirius shrugged.
"Might as well let him have his moment. Thought I'd hang out with you." "Why?" Remus replied through gritted teeth. "Thought you might want the company."
Remus didn't need to look at him now to know he was grinning that irritating serious black grin.
"Plus we're about to land, and I know you hate landing." "Piss off." "No. I'm warning you, Black. You can't punch me up here, Lupin, unless you want to let go of your broom." "God, you're annoying." "Yep."
Sirius flew up in front of them, then all the way around, a perfect orbit.
"Piss off!"
Remus tried to dodge him, wobbling dangerously.
"Time to land. Remember to stick your legs out and lean back, then bend your knees as you hit the— Oi!"
Remus had grabbed the tail of Sirius's broom and given it a hard yank. Laughing, Sirius righted himself, then flew back to Remus's side and gave him a hard shove back. Remus shook, but held on tight, making his descent. It was much smoother than before. He leaned back, then twisted quickly to push Sirius again.
"Out of my way," he yelled, going faster. "You can be the last one down for once." "Oh, no, you don't."
Sirius now grabbed Remus's broomtail, laughing, tugging him backwards. This was perhaps a step too far, as they were both quite close to the ground now. The two wrestling boys tumbled towards earth, brooms flying out from beneath them. They both crash-landed in a huge muddy puddle, skidding and rolling forwards, soaking their brooms in the process.
"Black! Lupin!"
Madame Hooch marched over to the two boys sprawled in the mud. The other Gryffindors gathered round, giggling and pointing. Sirius leapt to his feet with all of the grace his nobility possessed him with, and pulled Lupin up roughly by the hand. They both looked up at the teacher, blinking, water droplets from their eyes.
"What did I say about minding the puddle?"
Madame Hooch raised an amused eyebrow. She usually saw the fun in things.
"A point from Gryffindor. You better go and wash off in the showers. Off you go."
They both waddled toward the Quidditch changing rooms, holding out their heavy waterlogged robes.
"Bloody ridiculous kit,"
Remus grumbled as they stepped into the squat litter stone building.
"How are you ever going to dry it?" "The house elves will take care of that,"
Sirius replied, shaking his off and dumping it in a pile in the corner. Remus couldn't be bothered to ask what on earth house elves were. He pulled his own robes off and kicked away his boots, then entered a shower and cubicle to continue undressing. There were towels laid out already, and the water was deliciously warm. He leaned forward into the stream, letting it warm his blood, watching the mud and rogue blades of grass swirl down the drain. At least he'd got out of 40 more minutes of flying. He scrubbed his hands roughly over his hair. Without Matron's monthly haircuts, his hair was getting longer and softer, sticking straight up most of the time, as messy as James's. He could finally see the colour of it, but was disappointed. It appeared to be a bland, mousy brown. Remus finished in the shower before Sirius and got out, looking for his uniform quickly. He was half-dressed once Sirius finally emerged, his long hair swept back, wet and shining like oil. He was already fully dressed and looked impossibly cool and grown up, while Remus had realized he'd missed a button on his shirt and had to begin all over again.
"What's that?"
Sirius said suddenly. Remus looked up, then back down. Sirius was pointing at a long silver stripe which stretched from the
left half of his collar bound down diagonally across his chest to his right nipple. He fumbled with his buttons, trying to close the shirt faster. "A scar," he muttered. There was no point saying anything else now. He barely noticed them any more. They were just there, as much a part of him as his freckles or the fine hairs on his arms.
Did it happen to you at home, where you grew up?"
There was something odd in Sirius's voice. Remus found he couldn't speak, so he just nodded. Sirius nodded too.
"I've got scars,"
he said, so quietly that Remus thought he'd misheard at first. Sirius bent down and pulled up his trouser leg, turning his ankle to show Remus the marks there. His scars weren't like Remus's, which were big and rough and jagged, full of rage and hunger. The silver stripes on the backs of Sirius's legs were thin and straight, uniform in their cruelty. Remus stared for a few seconds before Sirius dropped the edge of the fabric and straightened up. They stared each other up and down for a full minute, Remus feeling very hot, Sirius's eyes cool and calm. Then it broke.
"Shall we go and watch James make a prat of himself?"
Sirius asked. Remus nodded again, and they both stepped back out in the cold autumn air. They took their seats on the hard benches in the spectator stands and watched the rest of the class flitting back and forth across the pitch, red robes fluttering behind them. Lily, though lacking James's formal technique, was giving him a run for his money when it came to speed, beating him in 2 of 3 races between goalposts.
"Remus,"
Sirius said suddenly as their classmates came in for their final landing.
"Yeah? You can't read, can you?"
Remus sighed. He had enough secrets to keep as it was, and Sirius had shared one of his.
"Nah. I won't tell anyone. Cheers."
That Sirius Black grin. Chapter 10, First Year, History. Saturday, 23rd of October, 1971.
"Did you just never get taught?"
Remus shrugged, tired and frustrated. It was a week after the flying lesson, and Sirius had caught him on his own again. He'd been sitting quite happily on his bed, flicking through one of James's Quidditch magazines. He liked the moving pictures, even if he still didn't understand the rules, and it was the closest thing to telly that they had at Hogwarts.
"I got taught,"
he replied, turning the page, hoping Sirius would take the hint and get lost. He didn't. Remus closed the magazine.
"I got taught,"
he repeated.
"Just didn't learn properly. When I look at the words, I don't think I see what everyone else sees. It doesn't make any sense. All the letters keep jumping around and changing. Teacher said I was just thick."
No one had ever made much of a fuss about his problems with schoolwork at St. Edmund's. They barely had any homework, since no one did it anyway. Lots of the boys had problems. Either they couldn't or wouldn't be taught. It wasn't as if anyone expected much either way.
"But how have you been doing it?"
Sirius was like a dog with a bone.
"Doing what?" "Well, everything. All your work here at Hogwarts."
Remus looked at him as if he was the one who was stupid.
"Sirius, I haven't been doing it. In case you haven't noticed, I'm in detention every night." "Well, yeah, obviously." Sirius waved a hand. "But the other day in potions I saw you. You didn't take any notes, didn't even look at the book or the blackboard, and you still prepared all the ingredients for the cure for boils perfectly. Slughorn gave you 5 points.
Remus felt himself blush at the memory. He wasn't used to getting praise from teachers.
"Oh, that was easy." He shook his head. "Sluggy told us how to do it in the lesson before. I just remembered it." "Bloody hell, you must have a brilliant memory then."
Remus shrugged. He supposed that was true. His teachers at St. Edmund's had remarked more than once that he knew an awful lot of words for someone so dim-witted. Sirius was staring into space now, clearly deep in thought. Remus could practically see the cogs working in his mind. Sometimes Sirius was an entirely closed book. Other times he was so easy to read it was almost funny.
"If you could read, you'd be as good as me and James. Better, probably."
Remus snorted.
"So modest, Black." "Well, you would."
Sirius missed the sarcasm completely, still looking thoughtful.
"Your wand work is much more natural, and if your memory is as good as you say it is..."
He chewed his lip.
"I bet there's a spell for it."
Remus laughed.
"You're going to cure me with a spell?" "Why not?"
Remus had thought about it already. Of course he had. But he was more aware of the limitations of magic than anyone. After all, he had scars which would not heal and a monthly nightmare which no one could prevent.
Magic just can't fix stuff like that, he replied bluntly. Why else does James wear glasses? I think there are spells for eyesight, Sirius said. Maybe they're just not worth the effort, or too dangerous or complicated or something. It's not just the reading, Remus countered. My writing's crap too. I'm slow and it comes out all messy. There are definitely spells for that, Sirius said confidently. You can bewitch your quill. I've seen my father do it on official documents. His handwriting's really scratchy normally.
Remus was at a loss. Sirius clearly wasn't going to give up. He chewed his lip.
Why are you so interested anyway? You're my fellow marauder. We can't have you in detention every day. What if the Slytherins strike back? We need your evil mind for pranks.
His eyes glittered.
Speaking of, I'm assuming you haven't done your history homework yet. Nope. Okay then, let's get started.
Sirius jumped off the bed and began rooting around in his trunk.
No, you're not doing my homework for me,
Remus protested, standing up himself, folding his arms.
Too bloody right, I'm not,
Sirius replied, withdrawing a heavy book. It was a history of magic. Remus recognized the size and shape.
I just fancied refreshing my memory, that's all. So I'm going to sit here and read it aloud because that helps me study. And if you happen to retain some of it in that enormous brain of yours, then there's not that much I can do about it.
Remus huffed.
Haven't you got something better to do? Where's James, anyway? Watching the Gryffindor Quidditch practice.
Sirius settled down on his bed, opening the book.
Reckons he'll get on the team next year, so he's trying to pick up some tips. Peter's followed him, obviously. Now, be quiet, please. I'm trying to work.
He cleared his throat.
A History of Magic by Bathilda Bagshot. Chapter 1. Ancient Egypt. The Rites and Rituals of Imhotep.
And on he went. And on. And on. Remus stayed standing for a while, trying to decide whether or not to just walk out of the room and slam the door. But he found that he really wasn't that angry. It was difficult to stay angry with Sirius, no matter how annoying he was. So Remus sat down and listened. It turned out that history wasn't that boring after all, once you understood the basics. Plus, Sirius was considerably more animated than Professor Binns. His voice was clear and steady, never stumbling over more complicated words or phrases, as if he'd read the book 100 times. Remus had heard him tell James that he was fluent in Latin and Greek. The Black family apparently took pride in that sort of thing. On he ploughed, chapter after chapter, from the gory Egyptian resurrection charms, to cryptic Greek oracles, to magical Mesopotamian priestesses. The ancient world opened up in Remus's mind, and he found himself lying back on his bed, arms behind his head with his eyes closed, letting Sirius lead him through time. Eventually, the other boy's voice was almost hoarse, and he just spoke above a whisper. Evening had closed round them, and the common room was bathed in a golden-orange glow as the sun set. Halfway through
Chapter 5, Tiberius and the Advancements of Roman Battle Magic,
Sirius let out a quiet cough and put down the book.
I don't think I can study today,
he croaked. Remus's eyes snapped open. He sat up, blinking.
That's okay,
he said quietly.
It's dinner now. I'm starving.
They both got up, stretched, and headed downstairs. James and Peter were waiting for them at the Gryffindor table in their usual seats.
How was practice?
Sirius asked, after draining a goblet of pumpkin juice. His voice had almost returned to normal, only sounding slightly strained.
Fracking,
James replied cheerfully, spearing a sausage on the end of his fork and using it to scoop up some mashed potato. How come you didn't come?
Homework,
Sirius replied, pouring gravy over his own mash. After they finished dinner, James regaled them with a blow-by-blow account of the Quidditch practice, listing every player on the team, their strengths and faults, their techniques, and what he could do to improve them. Peter interjected occasionally with his own opinions, which barely differed from James's. Pudding was millionaire shortbread, which neither Sirius nor James liked. Remus thought they were mad and took their distaste as evidence of their snobbery. He'd have eaten theirs too, but Peter got there first, scoffing the lot. I've got some sweets, the smaller boy offered, digging in his robe pockets and withdrawing a bulging brown bag. Mum sent them. Help yourself.
Cheers, Pete.
They dug in, munching their way through fizzing Whizbees, chocolate frogs, and flavour-changing gobstoppers happily. Remus helped himself to a few as well, until they all felt quite sick. "What homework were you doing?" James asked, scratching his chin distractedly. "I thought we'd finished everything for this week."
Yeah, I was behind on history. Had to go back and check something.
Sirius was scratching too, near his collarbone. Watching them made Remus start to itch. The back of his hand tickled as if a small insect were crawling over him. He suddenly thought of the itching powder and looked down. He nearly screamed. The back of his hand was growing thick, dark hair at an alarming rate. He was transforming. It wasn't anywhere near a full moon. How could this be happening? He stood up so suddenly he nearly fell over backwards. He had to get out. Fast. "What's up, Lupin?" James stared at him, startled. Remus looked back at him, then at Sirius. They were both growing hair too. Dark curls sprouted from their faces, their hands and arms, every bit of exposed skin. He gaped, speechless. He ran his tongue over his teeth. They weren't getting any longer. "Oh, bloody hell!" James said, looking down at himself, then at the other two boys. "What's going on?"
"Peter,"
Sirius growled, his face almost covered in hair.
"Are you sure your mum sent those sweets?"
Peter, who hadn't had any sweets yet, stared at them both and turned red, spluttering, "Well, I mean, I thought they were from her. They arrived this morning."
"Pete!"
James roared. People were looking at them now, turning and nudging each other. Soon the entire dining hall was whispering and pointing at the three incredibly hairy boys at the Gryffindor table. Plenty of people were giggling too. But of course, no one was laughing louder than Severus Snape over at the Slytherin benches.
"Come on!"
Sirius stood up, sticking his furry nose up the air of aristocratic dignity that was nothing short of hilarious.
"Let's go to the hospital wing. We can plot our revenge later."
As they left to howls of laughter from the rest of the great hall, Remus cringed in shame, covering his face with his hands. Every inch of him was now covered in the same glossy black hair. He didn't find it as funny as James and Sirius seemed to.
"Told you they'd strike back,"
Sirius muttered.